here in a dream. I'm just stuck here in a dream.
Welcome everyone to episode 17 of the Guns and Yoga podcast. My name is Wendy Hummel. This week, you're going to hear my conversation with Sonny Provetto. He grew up in the Bronx, moved to Vermont with aspirations of being a game warden, but ended up working as a cop until he retired and then became a clinician, exclusively working with first responders. Sonny and I talk about his career and how he ended up starting the Vermont Center for Responder Wellness. He's been advocating for the mental health and wellness of police officers for decades. Sonny talks about his personal experience with PTS and how he healed through EMDR. After advocating for a change in the workers' compensation laws in his state, Sonny started the Vermont Center for Responder Wellness with the intention of treating first responders through EMDR. We talk about this treatment modality and the success he has had with first responders. Sonny explains that EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, creates bilateral stimulation of the vagal nerve, which allows people to better tolerate a traumatic memory. Sonny and I discuss some of my favorite things like yoga and mindfulness. At his center, they offer free yoga classes for first responders, acupuncture, Reiki, biofeedback, and peer support services. Sonny talks about how implementing yoga directly impacts heart rate variability, which according to the HeartMath website refers to the psychophysiological coherence, a state of optimal function. So in a nutshell, our body and brain work better when we're in a state of coherence. We feel better and we perform better. Intentional breathing, which is something practiced during yoga, is one method of achieving the state of coherence. In this episode, I briefly mentioned the Yoga for First Responders program. I want to take a moment to tell you a bit more about this life-saving training. And yes, I said life-saving. I have been a Yoga for First Responders instructor for the past 5 years and have been teaching recruits, officers, deputies, and other first responders during that time. When I first attended my training, I knew it was special, but 5 years later, the training has improved far beyond my expectations. This past week, the agency that I work for, the Sedgwick County Sheriff's Office, hosted a Train the Trainer for Yoga for First Responders so that we could add more instructors and offer more classes. It's hard to put into words how amazing it really is. The founder and director, Olivia Mead, who I spoke with in episode 4, is not a first responder herself, but she had the forethought to integrate the evidence-based tools of yoga and apply them to police, fire, and other first responder professions with the intention of building resilience, processing stress, and enhancing performance. I have to brag on my local agency right now. The guys who attended the class were all in. They are defense tactics instructors and agency leaders who no doubt will help spread the tools of yoga to their brothers and sisters. There's still a stigma surrounding yoga, especially in police culture. Having men in particular as instructors, like my friends Tony, Gary, Mike, Danielle, and others, is going to be a game changer. And I am excited to see how they take the program to the next level and continue to chip away at the stigma of yoga as just stretching and only something that girls do. The program is based on using the tools of yoga to achieve optimal functioning of the psychophysiological system and mastery of the mind. But what does that really mean? One way that we achieve this is through breathing, breath work. The program teaches several breathing techniques, the foundational one being tactical breathing. This alone allows you to directly access your autonomic nervous system by inhaling and exhaling completely, extending your exhale, and nose breathing. You reprogram your stress response. This skill is critical for first responders who we can all agree have jobs in which the stress response is regularly activated throughout one shift. There's much more to this training, and if you're interested in learning more, visit yogaforfirstresponders.org or visit episode 4 and listen to my interview with Olivia. Now back to Sonny. If you find value in this episode, please share it, give us a review, and if you'd like to be notified of future episodes and want to receive our future newsletter, you can subscribe on our Podbean website. I would love to hear from you with questions, suggestions, ideas for future guests or topics that you'd like to hear about in the future. Welcome to the show, Sonny.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I guess I should have asked before we started recording, is it okay to call you Sonny, or do you prefer to be called something else?
No, the only time I was called something else was when I was in trouble. And there were five Salvatores in my immediate family, not in my one family, but my cousins and stuff like that. So we all got nicknames, and Sonny wasn't too bad.
Okay, all right, cool. I just wanted to make sure. So, you are, for those who are not familiar with you, you are the founder and direct clinical director, I believe, of the Vermont Center for First Responder Wellness, and you're a former police officer, and you are just doing amazing things, it sounds like, in Vermont. And I am very excited to hear all about it. So, if you don't mind, just maybe starting out, telling everybody a little bit about how things started for you, because you became a police officer before you landed where you are today.
True. So back in the 80s, I always had a desire to get into law enforcement, and born in the Bronx, lived in New York City. NYPD was always a dream of mine. And then I thought, well, maybe state police, I'll have a little bit more freedom. And then in the early days of the internet, I got on the internet and I checked all of New England to see who was testing. And Vermont happened to be testing like in 2 weeks. So I grabbed my best friend and I said, come on, we're going to go to Vermont. We're going to take the police test, the civil service test. And to be honest with you, my first idea of getting into law enforcement was not to be a police officer, but to be a game warden.
Oh.
Right? So a kid from the Bronx wants to be a game warden, goes to Vermont with his buddy, takes the test. Only in Vermont it happens this way. It's about 100 people taking this test, and then they score it while you sit there, and then they let you know where you are in the process as well. It's not like you leave and then you get a letter 2 months later. So the head of the testing starts calling out some names. My best friend's name gets called. He goes up to the front of the room and says, you can go stand over there. He says, oh, no, I don't want to be a cop or a game warden. He says, well, what are you doing here? He says, my friend wants to be a game warden. He says, who's your friend? He says, Sonny Provetto. And he says, flips through some papers and he says, Provetto. And I raise my hand and says, come up here. He says, well, you're not smart enough to be a game warden, but you're smart enough to be a trooper. And I said, okay, where do I sign up? And that's the story. And, Vermont is an amazing place. It's beautiful, as you know, but it also has some pretty progressive and some areas, Stowe, Vermont, Burlington, Vermont, which really represented a lot of the city that I didn't want to get away from, the arts and the theater. So I really found myself settling into the state and recognizing that, wow, although it's beautiful on the outside, there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of addiction, there's a lot of abuse, there's a lot of violence. And, and as we all get oriented, especially in the police academy, you begin to lose this picturesque idea of what policing is really about, and it doesn't take a long time for us to recognize that this job will expose us to a lot of things. So I started my career. I started my career actually with the Burlington Police Department as a municipal police officer for 5 years, and then I switched to the state police. And in that career, I did a lot of things. I did everything from investigating homicides to accidents to all the whole 9 yards, and teaching at the police academy. And I had the fortunate experience of getting involved in peer support about 6 or 7 years into my career. And the reason why I did that is because I experienced my own, sort of trauma, but we didn't talk about it as trauma.
Right.
Right? The first death notification I gave, I was standing outside an apartment. Detectives were inside, doing their thing. And a woman walking down the street says, what are you folks doing in my dad's apartment? And here I am, a brand new cop, and I had to just somehow figure out how I was going to tell the daughter of this man that her father had passed away, and all the detectives said to me was, put more Vicks in your nose and be quiet. Right? So
oh boy, yeah.
There was not this acknowledgement of the psychological stresses that I think officers face on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So fast forward, at the 8-year mark of my career, I was diagnosed with an eye condition, which was going to end it, and I had some time to plan. And so my career ended after 10 years, and it just made sense for me because I had an interest in police wellness to, go to graduate school, get a clinical degree in social work, and then really see what I could do with it. Because you got to remember, I think, in the late 1990s, 2000, 21st century policing tenets were just about coming out. I don't think they had come out yet about officer safety and wellness, right? We really need to make it a priority. So I think we're a little bit ahead of the curve. And then 9/11 happened. And I went to 9/11, as I said, on September 12th and began working as a clinician with the first responders on the pile for 6 months. And then I got hired by an organization, you may even know them, PAPA, the Police Officers Providing Peer Assistance. They are a nonprofit organization that provides all of the peer support for NYPD, right? So 35,000 police officers. So this is a nonprofit organization based in Lower Manhattan. So I began then going around to all the precincts, doing suicide prevention and psychoeducation, and really started my career, and then doing therapy and doing groups with cops who had all been on the pile at 9/11, right? And what that really opened up for them was a stigma-breaking excuse to seek help. Mm-hmm. Right? So this was, 2001 was 9/11. 2003, we had an onslaught of NYPD police officers seeking mental health treatment because they waited until they looked around and they knew it. Then now this is acceptable to ask for help, right? It took that experience. What we also learned, I think, from that experience is that the field of psychology is not prepared for first responder trauma. It's like none of the books really spoke about it. And so it really opened my eyes to start thinking about how do we treat police officers for their trauma. And their trauma is completely different. So make my way back to Vermont. I actually retired because I thought I had enough. I was diagnosed with PTSD in 2003, did the work I needed to do, bought a farm, came back to Vermont, and became a farmer. And it's a true story.
Wow.
The most stressful job I ever had was farming.
You've got to be kidding.
I swear to God. And all the people who know what I'm talking about. You have no control over the weather or control over the animals or the equipment, so on and so forth. And then it took an incident at the Burlington Police Department, and they called me up and they said, hey, we would like your help if you would help us. We've had this all take place. And that's where I came back into the profession with a much invigorated energy, and I created what's called a CARES program, so a career assistance, resourcing, education, and support. So it's all about career development. It's about helping people get to where they want in their career, keeping them interested in their career, providing psychological education, obviously, psych resources for them. And it really became a big hit. So fast forward to 2018, or actually 2016, where I became frustrated as a treating provider for many of my organizations. I have 10 organizations who contract with the center today. I became frustrated in not being able to get officers the help they needed when they were injured on the job from either an acute stress reaction or post-traumatic stress. And that involved us changing the workers' comp law. So in 2016, I testified in front of the legislature, and what I said to them was this. I said, listen, we know so much more about trauma today than we ever have. In 2013, when the new DSM-5 came out, it actually put police officers in the DSM. Mm-hmm. So the brand new criteria that was added was the intense or repeated exposure to traumatic material, i.e., police officers reviewing the aversive details of a child abuse case. So here you had it front and center. You didn't have to get almost killed or have a serious bodily injury from an event. You now could get it from sitting in front of your computer, writing up an affidavit about a child abuse case. And that's what I said to the legislature. I said, listen, if we can be harmed just by the words on a piece of paper, right? We need to be able to get police officers the help they need quickly. If we can treat them quickly, right? Identify the signs and symptoms, treat them quickly, get them back to work quickly. And I said to them, we have a modality called EMDR that can do that. There wasn't one legislature that voted against it, and it became law in 2017. And then in 2018, people came to me and said, how are you going to treat all these people now that you changed the law? I said, I'm going to open up a center. And so The center started with me. And
So
then we
this
had
is in, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
just making sure, because wow, you just said a lot. Amazing.
Yeah.
All of that led up to you opening up your center so it's only been open since 2018. Is that right?
It's been open since 2018.
Okay.
And we went from me being the sole therapist to I have 14 therapists that work here.
Oh, amazing. Wow.
I have 14 therapists, 6 yoga instructors, a Reiki instructor, acupuncturist. What else do I got going on here? And so we have our own yoga studio. We offer free yoga classes to all first responders. Those people just show up, and you can show up wearing your gym shorts or baggy sweatpants or whatever. So we really wanted to break down the stigma. Yoga has a certain connotation, and we're trying to make sure that people recognize that it's one of the best ways to balance our nervous system.
Well, you are speaking my language there, obviously.
Right. So, and with COVID, there's been a lot of adjustments, obviously, at the center because things had to go virtual. But the best thing about virtual is that it opened up the center from people all over the country.
Amazing,
right?
yeah.
So I have an organization in Pennsylvania. All I had to do was go to the Office of Professional Regulation, and it took me about 3 hours for me to get licensed in Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
So people could seek treatment from us in Vermont.
Interesting, because from just speaking with other clinicians, I didn't realize that it was, maybe it's a streamlined process there, but how about other states? Is that typical that
I
you
want to
can
say
do that?
it's pretty typical because of COVID. Now, I can't say when they're going to lift take away that option, but the option is afforded to us right now.
So besides anybody in Vermont, you can also do teletherapy with people in the state of Pennsylvania, right?
Yes, and you can even do remote teletherapy with EMDR.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. So I just want to back up a minute because I really want to talk a lot more about EMDR.
Sure.
I'm personally very interested in it. I think other people, we've heard the term a lot in law enforcement when it comes to therapy, but nobody really understands what it is. But so just back to 2018, you started out your wellness center and it was just you. And then how did it grow? What made you think, okay, I'm going to add, because when I checked out your website, not only do you offer yoga, you offer mindfulness, biofeedback, you have somebody who's a heart math instructor or trained. So you have a lot going on, peer support. So can you kind of tell us how all that happened?
Sure. So, well, first of all, being a clinician and advocating for my police officers, especially when they have a diagnosis of PTSD, because there's no X-ray or there's no MRI that we can say and prove, it becomes this subjective, kind of debate. And it's not the organizations that don't want to support their officers. It's the insurance company. It's basically the insurance company counting dollars. So one of the things that I recognize that we could do is biofeedback is a biological marker of the balance of our nervous system. Mm-hmm. If we know that trauma is a stress-related disorder, right? For those who are suffering from post-traumatic stress, the ability to use a computer program that just basically describes the functioning of the person's nervous system and takes out the subjective nature of the person who's been affected. Now we have an objective piece of information that we can show either supports the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress or does not. Right?
So how does it work? You get someone. Sure. Can you kind of walk me through what that looks like?
So so it measures heart rate variability. And by the way, yoga is one of the best practices that improves heart rate variability, right? So now we brought in this modality of yoga, right? So we're measuring heart rate variability. If you have poor heart rate variability, you have a nervous system that will react to something and not recover quickly. That's the worst scenario for a police officer, right? So we're able to, we put a sensor on your earlobe, plug you up to this computer. It's an EKG, so it measures your heart rate, right? And it also measures the coherence or the balance between your respiratory system and your circulatory system. So the two autonomic systems that are governed by the emotional brain, right? So the survival brain controls those two systems. There's no faking this. Seriously, if you say you have PTSD and I hook you up to the biofeedback program and it says that you have a pretty solid nervous system and you have a flexible state of mind, then there's going to be other questions that I'm going to have to ask. What we also do is we ask officers to get a salivary cortisol test from their primary care physician. Why do we do that? Contrary to belief, we would believe that cortisol would be very high in people who have post-traumatic stress. On the contrary, it's extremely low.
Really?
And it's extremely low because the mechanisms that produce cortisol get worn out because the system's always producing cortisol when it doesn't need it. Right? So the center really became this organization around, treating first responders the best way possible, but also, promoting their wellness and getting the compensation that they needed so they can get back to work. And I'll be honest with you, there has not been one officer since 2018 who has not gone back to work.
Wow, that's amazing. So let me ask you this. When you put somebody on this biofeedback machine to measure their heart rate variability, do you put them through like certain scenarios, or do you make them think about certain things, or this is just them sitting and getting monitored?
So I manage 10 wellness programs in different organizations. Think of having a baseline biofeedback reading for every officer pre-critical incident, right? Before they get involved in a critical incident. Then they're involved in a critical incident and the chief wants to know, hey, can my people go back to work, right? Yeah, so we have a pre-test, right? And now I can measure their current state towards that pre-incident reading to see how far off they are, or they're just about the same, right? So we have a clear way of telling whether or not our officers can go back to work and handle stress, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
So
you contract with these agencies. They put everyone through just a baseline test, and then is that right?
That's right.
What if someone didn't get that baseline test and they wanted to come to you and they wanted to kind of see where they were at? Would that still?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
So we offer a 6-month wellness checkup. Doesn't cost anybody anything. You come in, we run you through biofeedback, we get a reading of what that is, we take an assessment of how you did the last 6 months, what you do good, what do you need to change, how's your drinking, how's your relationship, how's job satisfaction. You look at all of these factors, and we guide these officers through their career so they stay interested in what's going on. And some of the times when officers are struggling, I ask them to get interested in peer support. Because the idea of being a peer mentor is about practicing your own self-care. To answer your original question, do you put the officers through a scenario? We don't, because their heart math makes a 1-minute HRV test. So for 1 minute, we ask you to do a 6-second breath in and a 6-second breath out, and think of driving your cruiser down the interstate at 85 miles an hour, because that's usually trooper speed, and then slamming on the brakes. That's what we're asking the vagal nerve to do when we give you that HRV 1-minute test. So it allows us to see how much you can regulate your nervous system when you need to. And when people can't, that's poor HRV.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so, we don't want those folks on the road. Right? Think about that. Until that HRV gets to a place where we know that they can handle a stressful situation, we want them really to be engaged. And it might be only yoga. It may be only mindfulness. So, yeah, it's a great tool that we use here, for sure.
So if you don't mind, just for anybody who might be listening who still isn't exactly sure what heart rate variability means, can you just quickly explain what that means, what you're measuring? Sure.
So when we hook you up to the program, what we're really measuring is the beats of your heart in between each pulse. And so most people won't realize that their heart beats between each pulse, right? So good heart rate variability would be the ability to go from 67 beats in a minute up to 115 beats in a minute, right? And back down to 68 beats in a minute. That's good heart rate variability. poor heart rate variability would be to go from 70 beats a minute to 125 beats a minute to 96 beats a minute to 115 beats a minute to 57 beats a minute, all over the place.
Gotcha.
That's a nervous system that can't regulate itself, right? And because most of what we deal with can be stressful, right? I mean, the stress response happens in offices 3-4 times a day, right? Good heart rate variability, which really can be managed through the practice of yoga, right, is essential for us staying healthy. I mean, it's really a marker of overall health.
Absolutely. And, one of the things, and I know you know this because you keep referring to it, but, I was trained through Yoga for First Responders as well. I'm a certified yoga teacher. And one of the big things, probably the number one thing that we preach when we teach classes, and I do this in any class I teach, not even just to first responders, is how breathing is a direct link to your nervous system. That's how you access it. And it's the number one self-regulation tool. And so that is probably something that is probably the easiest thing to tell people too, because you can teach people how to breathe in a certain way when they're sitting in a classroom.
It's funny you say that, because the first time I had an officer work with one of my yoga teachers, she walked out of the studio and she says, "He doesn't know how to breathe." And I chuckled a little bit, right? And the other thing that I think really speaks to what you're talking about is, we wear 25 pounds now over our shoulders. And I can remember the days of pulling the vest down, and if you had the trauma plate in there, we sit in these cruisers, we sit in these police cars, we do everything in front of us. We lift weights, so we have a more tendency to kind of close off our diaphragm, keep it, and we wrestle with people, and that's all this, your arms coming in and tightening up your chest. The only way you can breathe is if you open up your shoulders, and that's really important, I think, for people to recognize. As a weightlifter my whole life, I would take a lot of short breaths to gain the power to push the weights. That's not what we want officers to do. We want officers to take long, deep breaths, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's right. So, it's interesting that culture kind of taught us one thing, and what we're saying about staying healthy, we're kind of saying, hey, it's really the other thing.
Exactly. And I mean, I do this probably several times a week where I talk about that exact thing, because you can actually see as you're walking people through this, the change, because most of us sit hunched over, even if we don't realize it, which that in and of itself, vest or not, will activate the stress response by closing off all these main systems like respiration and heart. And even it's funny to just watch people as they realize it when you walk them through it, just by sitting up tall and releasing their shoulders back and away from their ears. Like that in and of itself can make a big difference. And just imparting that wisdom, like, hey, when you're sitting in your patrol car, you'll have this vest on, try this. And so anyhow, you and I are speaking the same language. So I'm glad to hear you guys also are teaching that as well.
Right. Well, and the other thing in the Heart Math program is the program is really designed around people to pay attention to their breathing, right? So it measures, and we're talking about it. See, it measures the change in the balance of the rhythm in the heart and in the lungs. So when you take over that autonomic system, the heart has to sync itself to the rhythm of your breath. And that's how we change blood pressure, heart rate. So think about that. It's really the science of the heart, right? The heart and our lungs are connected. And we can't get in there and change the beat of the heart, but we can control our breath, which changes the beat of the heart. And so that's why, one of the best things that officers can do, peer support officers can do, is always bring people back to their breath. I just need you to breathe. Just focus on your breath. Just take some deep. A very simple technique, by the way, is one of the key techniques in EMDR's early intervention techniques, which we're using to teach peer support members how to stabilize and ground officers after a critical incident.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in hearing about that. But I have one other quick question before we get into that, because it's something that seems like it could be so effective. So if you have, for instance, like in Kansas, if I wanted to to have someone trained or find someone who's trained in biofeedback and heart math to do exactly what you're talking about. Is that something that insurance pays for? Or is this something that the agency, you contract with the agencies that they pay for? So how does that work?
Well, what I would say is I would get your department to pay for 2 or 3 people, depending on how big your department is. It's about a $1,500 course, and you'll get certified as a heart math coach. You'll get the program, so you can download it on your computers, and you have people who will be trained to administer it. You can use it as a pre-screening tool, like we do, right? So you can run your people through it. The only thing I would ask you that's going to be a question is, because if you're not a licensed clinician, where's the confidentiality? So,
Right.
There are also a little bit of some roadblocks when peer support teams themselves like to want to use it. However, I know in the state of New Hampshire, not Vermont yet, because I have a legislator who keeps dropping the ball, but in New Hampshire, they have passed a law that says peer-to-peer information is confidential.
We have the same thing actually.
That's awesome.
In Kansas, we have a state statute that protects, and there's exceptions obviously if somebody's suicidal or homicidal, but
Right.
yeah, we have the same protection here. So
then you guys could utilize heart math in your wellness program.
interesting. Okay, that's
Yeah.
that's really good information. Thank you. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about EMDR now, for those who don't know about it, and how you are starting to train peers.
Sure. So, excuse me. Like I said, I was diagnosed with PTSD in 2003.
Yeah.
I went through 7.5 years of psychoanalysis, right? And I was convinced that I was good, and I believed I was good, right? And I went off on my way, right? Did my work. Interesting story. The way I knew that I was struggling was I was doing a group with a bunch of NYPD officers in an office somewhere down on Broadway in Manhattan, and some people were really struggling. I mean, as you can imagine, right? Lost friends. Some people lost family members. Worked in the towers. There was this one guy, he was just not present. I think he was I don't know why he would come, to be honest with you. So I asked him to step out of the group, and I went into the hallway, and I just began to choke him. And this is a true story. And I recognized what I was doing. I said, get out of here and don't come back. And then the next day I went to my boss, and I said, I think I need to take a break. And he says, why? And I said, because I choked this guy out of a group. He said, oh, he deserved it. I said, gee, no, you don't recognize. I mean, I'm suffering myself. This is such a true story for everybody. We don't pay attention to the signs and the symptoms, right? We don't pay attention to our drinking. And then I went to therapy, and then I got convinced that I was okay. And
So this is when you were, if I'm following you right, when you made that realization, you yourself were a trained therapist? You were a clinician at that time?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I was tracking.
You can't see it, right? And then I knew when I went to choke this guy that was a visceral reaction to what was going on inside of me. And I went and got the help. And the talk therapy was helpful. Kept me grounded, kept me working on things. 7 years took a long time. But if you're a therapist, you need to be in therapy, right? This is one thing I learned.
I've heard that before.
Yeah. And so in 2011, when I started back up in Vermont and I was doing all of this stuff, I always wanted to get trained in EMDR. I had read Francine Shapiro's book, I would say probably in the mid-90s. I was fascinated by it. And then I went to get trained in it. And, like us as police officers, we wonder if people can hold on to what I may tell them, what my trauma may be, what I've seen, what I've done in my career. And I met my mentor who was actually doing the training. His name is Mark Nickerson. And I knew the minute I met Mark that this guy is going to be my therapist. Right? So I went through the training, and in the training of getting trained in the procedures of administering EMDR, I went deep into my own trauma. And stuff came out for me in a conference room in a motel, in a hotel with 2 other therapists who I'm working with, about me almost being killed on the job. And I was thinking to myself, I'm good with this. Why is this coming up? Like, why am I getting emotional, right?
Yeah.
Because one of the things that EMDR teaches us and trains us to look for is that, we are resilient as individuals. Every one of your officers that goes out there and deals with whatever we deal with on a daily basis, comes to work the next day, sits in roll call, gets his duty bag, gets out there on the road. The human mind is really resilient. So what it does for traumatic events that we can't understand, and by the way, we don't know which ones are understandable and which ones are totally fully integrated. What the mind does is it sticks these memories in an amnestic memory network. So it sticks it in a network that's filled with amnesia. Pretty smart, right? Shove that in there. It doesn't make me, I can forget some of the aspects of the event. I have a very poor memory around 9/11. Why? It was my brain's way of keeping me capable of not being overwhelmed every day.
Well, and it was protecting you,
That's right.
is what it
Exactly.
sounds like. Yeah.
Right. You look at your 20 and 30-year veterans, right? There's that brain is protecting them. Well, at the same time, the brain that amnestic memory network doesn't do anything about our behaviors or our thinking. Right?
Yeah.
What EMDR does, if you think about this, EMDR is the key point of EMDR is the eye movements. Why do we incorporate eye movements, right? We incorporate eye movements because in rapid eye movement sleep is when the human mind consolidates memory. Every night when we go into REM sleep, we update our memory banks of what we experienced during that day. So we know that eye movements are critical to formation of adaptive memories. So if we believe, and EMDR teaches us that we all possess the ability to heal, right? Our minds do possess the ability to heal, just like our skin possesses the ability to scab over and heal a cut. So EMDR, using eye movements, so we create the bilateral stimulation, right? Which is really neurofeedback. It's the stimulation of the vagal nerve, which allows people to tolerate a traumatic memory better. If you can keep people in a window of tolerance where they can go back into a traumatic memory and not be overwhelmed again, we ask them to utilize the dual attention. The attention of being in the room with the EMDR therapist, which is the present, and going back into the past, into the memory, and noticing the information that you may not have noticed before. I'll tell you my own personal experience. So I had a really big bad guy try to kill me one night. It was New Year's Eve. And I relied on all of my training, and it was so seamless. Everything I was taught to do, I was doing, and I was really recognizing it wasn't working. Pepper spray, baton, this guy was still coming after me, and then I'm on my trigger, and then finally I recognized that he can't see me because I really pepper sprayed him a lot. And he was trying to look for me, and then I didn't want to shoot him and kill him, so I went hands-on with him, and I got him on the ground, and I got him handcuffed with 2 handcuffs. I had to scream to the other trooper to send me his handcuffs. Give me your handcuffs, because I'm looking for the other boots to be on the pile to help me handcuff this guy, and he didn't. So I double handcuffed this guy, and then I ran in the house, and I dialed the local PD to come out and help me. And people always ask me, why'd you dial local PD? Why don't you just call for backup? I never had an answer for them. When I was going to retire, I was offered by the colonel a position in headquarters that I could ride out another 10 years and get a full retirement. And I said, no, I want out. It wasn't until EMDR that I recognized how that trooper betrayed me, didn't help me, how I didn't trust the department, how I wanted out, I didn't need to get out, right? EMDR allowed me to work through so many side stories of that traumatic. It wasn't about me fighting this guy. It was about all of these other things about I don't feel safe in my life. EMDR brought that up, I can't tell you how many years later, like 17 years later, I went back into that memory and got rid of it. Totally integrated it.
That is fascinating because to hear you in the beginning, I thought, well, he had no choice. He had to retire medically. No. That obviously isn't the case. And it's...
I ran. And this is interesting. all of, what's in that amnestic memory network are a couple of things that are in all of us, right? So our addictive behaviors are subconscious. Our relational patterns are subconscious. How I relate to you, how I relate to my organization, how I relate to my kids. And you have to remember that I was making decisions because I was traumatized and was not even aware of it. And this comes at a time when, this was 1996. This comes at a time when nobody asked me if I needed to see somebody.
Right.
I was stuck with. So for 6 months, I put Scotch tape on my windows, right? When I went to work. And in Vermont, you take your cruiser home. Your cruiser sits in your driveway. So everybody in town knows where the trooper lives. So I'd get off duty at 2:30 in the morning, and I would sneak through the woods, and I'd go around my house and make sure nobody broke in, and then I'd go back and get my cruiser, and then I'd drive down my driveway.
Wow.
That's not healthy.
Yeah, I would say not. So let me just make sure I'm tracking. So 17 years after you left is when this realization occurred during your EMDR training, right?
Training. Yeah, I wasn't even going for therapy.
Okay. So how did that change things for you? Because that's a pretty big revelation to
Right.
not know consciously and then to realize that.
So I want you to think of trauma as a form of stress. Traumatic stress is a form of stress that lives based on unconsolidated, unprocessed memories. So your body's always dealing with that stress, even though you're sitting at a baseball game with your kid, right, playing Little League. Your body's still dealing with that traumatic stress. And I always say, especially when you have two people in a relationship and they're both first responders, you interact with each other through this lens of trauma, whether you know it or not, right? Because think, all of our unprocessed trauma is still causing stress in our lives. How well we cope with that stress is another story. So 17 years later, I had this revelation of why I made decisions in my life. It helps me make decisions today, by the way, right? Remember, you don't make any big decisions when you're under stress. So you can look at it this way. One is, I got rid of a lot of unprocessed traumatic events in my life that were causing a certain amount of traumatic stress, which I no longer deal with. Took our overall health, right? I don't want that stress, right? My blood pressure, I'm 62, I don't take one medication at all.
That's amazing.
Right? I'm nothing special, but one of the things I recognize that mental health is the key to my physical health. And so I say to people all the time, I say to retirees 4 years prior to retiring, come in. Let's talk about, I have a book on my desk, you probably can't see it. It's a binder. And this officer put together all of the news articles, all of the photographs, all of anything that he was involved with. It's this thick.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so let's make sure that we get rid of all this stuff before you slide into retirement, because in retirement, you don't have the routine, you don't have the relationships, right? And you may find yourself with idle time. And when you have idle time, that mind's going to knock on your door and say, hey, remember me? And that's when you don't want to deal with it.
I'm really glad you said that, because that's something that's, especially since I retired myself, and a lot of the people that I worked with over the years are either retired now or getting ready to.
Right.
And there's a lot of people that are in different places when it comes to what you just said. And one thing too is that some people retire and they go from, one extreme to the complete other. Others have other jobs, others plan travel and have things that they plan to do. So what I'm assuming when you talk to these officers that are getting ready to retire, you talk about that, like having a plan, not only processing what you've dealt with over the years, but what's next.
Exactly right. And one thing I find very common is police officers don't know how to parlay their experiences into the private sector. And, and I could just, you can go through everything they're good at, right? They're good at a lot of things. They're good at writing. They're good at assessment. They have people skills. And so, you can help somebody really kind of find a pathway that, allows them, first of all, many people stay too long because they don't have an idea of what they're going to do. And that's detrimental as well.
Yeah, I see that a lot because, we get so focused on, we have to stay X amount of years to get this and to get that. And it's just, we don't look at all of the other opportunities that we could have because we get so focused, laser focused on that. Plus, you're exactly right. I've had so many people say to me, well, I don't know what else I would do.
Right.
And then my response is similar to what you just said is, well, you could do a lot more than you think.
Right. Right, and fortunate for the profession, there's the federal system or even the state system that, officers can leave us being a sworn police officer and go into and be an investigator with DMV or, Office of Professional Regulation and investigate other people's licenses, right? So they really do have a lot of skills, and I think at the state level you can see that people can really fit into a lot of jobs. I mean, some officers are retiring and going into the schools.
Yeah.
Right. And so, so we do have a lot of, and then you have those officers say, I don't want anything to do with enforcing anything, and for some of them, it's maybe a little bit more of a challenge, but it's really critical that we pay attention to retirement for our folks.
So at your facility at the Vermont Center for Responder Wellness, is that something that you offer? And you talked a little bit about that, but do you have somebody or is it you that talks to retirees or people getting ready to retire about that?
So what the center also offers is professional peer support. Not that what you have in your organization is not professional, but we have people who work at the center who are our peer specialists. So these are usually retired men and women who go to our contracts and our organizations, have coffee with a cop every day, just checking in, or shows up, if there's a critical incident. These are folks who have navigated their careers very well, and they offer great insight into opportunities for retirement or what to do planning for retirement. So it's not only myself, but it's also two of the other people who work here, who, one person has 35 years of law enforcement experience, the other one's has 25, really help people navigate how to get into retirement and, more importantly, be healthy. As all the work that John Violante has done around, mortality rates, we're trying to push those rates a little bit higher than 10 to 12 years. We'd love for them to be 30 years, right? Because when you're getting out at 50, we should be living to be 90.
Yeah, exactly. Because, I think the first time I started looking into what you're talking about, the research said 5 years after retirement, which we now know isn't true, but it's still not that much better.
Right. And that just goes to show you, and I think a lot of Violante's work is around the long-lasting effects of having a stress response. So the stress response, right, the increased heart rate, cortisol, blood pressure, turning on the blue lights, going code to something and, and then dealing with that and then waiting for your body to come back to some balance or some homeostasis, that turning on and turning off of that system, they call it the allostatic load, the turning on and off of that system is detrimental to us if we're not taking steps to make sure it's not as detrimental. And, and I'm looking at you and I'm smiling because, one of the key factors of managing this stress is practices of yoga. And by the way, when I talk about yoga, and I have a very limited knowledge, I know that yoga, the practice of yoga, incorporates all of these different things: breathing, concentration, movement. All of them are helpful for our officers who sit in a cruiser sedentary until they have to open the door and make a mad dash. And that's why it's so interesting that, I don't know if you experience, but when we talk about yoga here in Vermont, some people give the eyebrow roll and, you get faces about it. But the reality is that we're making people believers that really this is a great modality, and they can do it online. You can do it in the privacy of your living room. You can go to a yoga studio, right?
Oh, absolutely. Right. And I think you talked about it earlier when it came to the stigma and the preconceived notions of what people think of when you say the word yoga. When I first started introducing yoga in 2016, it took a minute. Even though I work at the agency and people know me, which could be very different than an outsider coming in, it still took a while to catch on, but there were a lot of people that believed in it, just like you're talking about. And so now, we're at the point where we're incorporating yoga for first responders into the recruit training. I offer weekly classes and we get about an average of 10 people.
Awesome.
And as we speak, this is kind of timely. In a week from now, we're going to be doing a train the trainer so that we can get more trainers on board. And besides me right now in town, there's only one other person, and she's retired captain and she still helps out. But what I think is going to be really neat is we're going to have several male instructors that work on the agency. And I think not to say that people don't want to learn from me, but you know what I'm saying? It's different. Most people in law enforcement are men. And so by having these guys who are defense tactics instructors, who people are familiar with, if they're saying yoga is helpful, then that's just going to help spread it. Yeah.
One of the people that I use is the former labor attorney who negotiated all the police and fire contracts, right? So all the cops know him. And he retired at 65. He's 72. He went on to become a yoga teacher. Awesome. He works with all of my people, and they all know each other. Because half of these people were on the union, right? Like, yeah. So, yeah, it's very important to blend that familiarity with people and using that to further the idea that, hey, this is acceptable, this is really helpful, making that the norm, and that also goes to be breaking down that stigma.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like no trust factor. They know who you are, they like you, and then they trust you because of your, of who you are, what you've done. And so it's key, just like anything else with cops, the person that's delivering the class or they're hearing from, they have to have some sort of cred, really, basically, with them.
Absolutely.
So,
Yep.
So when it comes to, I wrote it down, one quick question about EMDR, and then we can move on to something else. You talked about the back and forth eye movement, which is the same as what happens in REM sleep. If I was following you right, the bilateral eye movement is what's happening when we're sleeping. What if someone is going to go and get EMDR, but they have horrible sleep? I mean, I know we're talking about two different things, but is getting better sleep going to help make the EMDR more successful, or does it matter?
I think it works two ways. One is, obviously, we know how critical sleep is. Mm-hmm. So for all of our officers who don't sleep well, I want you to remember that really is the hyper-arousal of your nervous system that keeps you up. Mm-hmm. Okay. Second of all, EMDR not only works in REM sleep, but EMDR works in the middle of EMDR, right? So when we're administering the eye movements, and I have a device that, it's a light bar, basically runs back and forth, and officers can use that, or we put these tappers in their hands and these things pulse, alternating pulsing. The idea of using the bilateral stimulation, think about this, the bilateral stimulation in REM sleep, the eye movements stimulate the emotional brain and our rational brain, and it signals it to update the information of our day. In EMDR, the EMDR therapist works with you to find a target memory, a portion of your memory that may be disturbing. It also helps you identify an irrational belief that you have about yourself. I'm not good enough, right? I didn't drive fast enough. So when we're doing the EMDR in the session, the officer's eyes are usually closed because they're holding on to things that buzz in their hands. Excuse me. Their officer's eyes are usually closed. They're 99% of the time silent. They're not telling the therapist what they're noticing. So for some people who, and you know that most people who suffer from post-traumatic stress are alexithymic. And alexithymia means I can't put words to my feelings. So if you're doing talk therapy and you suffer from PTSD, how can you express or even understand yourself how I feel? EMDR doesn't require words. It requires a person to come up with an image that represents the worst part of that experience. And for officers, you and I know that sometimes it's not what most people think it is. It's the kid standing down the hallway who's staring at me and he's 4 years old and wants to wonder why daddy's not getting up. That's what we get affected by. EMDR, when it increases the neural communication between the survival brain and the rational brain, the rational brain, which is technically deactivated in a stressful call, right? It allows that rational brain to accept that information. And that information that's now coming in, and the reason why you're silent is because we only ask you to notice that kid down the hall and then allow your own internal association to that experience to resonate with you. You know, the minute any of us think of a word, or like that image I just gave you, so you went to a kid standing down the end of a hallway. That's a bunch of information. So trauma is really about the mind's ability to reprocess the information that was present at a traumatic call. And when we think about what's bothering us, we are only using 10% of our mind's ability, which is conscious, to identify what's bothering us. And that's why talk therapy takes a really long time. EMDR allows this bilateral stimulation to stimulate the vagal nerve, allow us to have a greater window of tolerance to go back into something that's distressing. And when we have a greater window of tolerance, our rational brain wants to stay with us, right? So in the general public, and there's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah, I've read it.
Yeah, and you know,
It's awesome.
Van der Kolk talks about the deactivation of the rational brain because the survival brain is designed to keep us alive. We, as responders, utilize our rational thinking because it's implicit memory, which is developed from our training. However, it doesn't change the fact that we're still exposed to a distressing or traumatic call. EMDR increases that neural communication, allows that information to be part of the experience. And so when we're experiencing a traumatic call, you know, memory is fragmented and sometimes disorganized because the rational brain is not necessarily fully present. This is why the IACP gives us 3 sleep cycles. You know, when an officer is involved in a critical incident, right? Before that officer gives a formal statement, we want them to experience 3 full sleep cycles. Why? We want them to get through REM sleep. We want them to consolidate the experience into the best memory they can, right? And so the IACP is still going now on the same, you know, theoretical foundation that EMDR works on. EMDR believes that, you know, we need to have consolidated memories. However, memories can be affected in a traumatic call. EMDR allows us to go back into the memory, increases the window of tolerance, and the officers make their own internal associations to their experience. They don't rely on the therapist to make the connection for them. And this is why it's so powerful and so effective and it works so quickly. So your question was REM sleep. What happens if officers don't get good sleep? 2 things happen. 1, they can still do the work in the office with the therapist because the bilateral stimulation is tricking the brain that it's in REM sleep. And 2, a large majority of the time, my clients tell me they've never slept that good in a really long time. And why is that?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about. Like, if you do this and it's successful, does that help you sleep better? Like, do they kind of go hand in hand?
Absolutely. So, you know, again, I talked in the beginning of the hyperarousal keeps us up. When we keep our mind, so think about this. We are targeting a specific memory or memories, and we are asking you to notice those older memories. Those memories are now back in short-term memory. Like they almost have a special, like, you know, a tag on them to say, hey, these have been here before. We need to take a look at these again. So it's almost like they have a special level of importance. And people are locked down in REM sleep longer because we've kind of given it the same scenario. We have done the bilateral stimulation of that memory. And so when you're in REM sleep, it almost like it sticks even more. And what I will tell you is that none of my clients can tell me why they feel better the next day or 2 or 3 days later. But what they always say to me, which is very consistent, and I've done over 15,000 EMDR sessions, what they always say to me is, I just feel lighter on my feet. And so what I'll say to them, I want you to go back to that original memory. When you think of it now, how distressing is it? And they go back and they say, it's like a 2. Doesn't really bother me, right? You know, and for first responders, we won't get to a 0, right? Because we're too efficient. We know that I'm going to go see this or go see that. So you know, my experience as an EMDR therapist with first responder is that a 2 is like a 0 for the general public. Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I've seen it work so many times.
So if I'm not trying to oversimplify this, but for someone who's listening, the bottom line is if there's something that you're dealing with, whatever that is for you, if you get EMDR, it sounds like what you're saying is you're integrating it and then you're able to think of the same exact incident in a completely different way and have a completely different response.
Completely different. And we get rid of the negative belief, right? So most responders feel like they're not good enough because, you know, we get the call, you know, we're running there as fast as we can. We always want to get a better outcome of what's happening, and sometimes that's not possible, right? So the irrational belief is that, you know, I didn't do CPR enough, I didn't drive fast enough, you know, I should have done something different. That's the irrational thinking. EMDR allows them to see the call. I usually say to officers, I want you to go back into that call, but this time I want you to watch that from 1,000 feet above and watch everything you're doing. And so they're bringing in the information, like they're seeing everything. I had an officer tell me the other day that, and it's okay to talk about calls, right? Because I'm assuming that the audience is.
Oh, absolutely.
So, you know, as a trooper, we see some really crazy things with cars. This guy had gone through the windshield, but got stuck halfway through. And he was so drunk that he was actually cutting his abdomen on the windshield as we got there. And you know, and we can see what he's doing. And he has no idea of it. It's so bizarre that this guy doesn't realize that he's literally cutting himself in half. And so the EMT saying to me, and I tried to slide the backboard down behind him, you know, he's still inside the car, like his thighs are up against the steering wheel. And that was, I mean, as I say to you, it disturbs me, right? So for this EMT, he feel like he didn't do the right thing. But when I asked him to look at that whole call that he was on from 1,000 feet above and notice everything you're doing, he said, oh my God, I got it. I said, well, what do you got? He says, there's nothing else I could have done. Right? Because now he sees himself operating, and that new information of seeing himself operate creates the meaning that he needs to make himself feel confident and good enough to continue to be an EMT.
And it sounds a little bit like it's incorporating mindfulness because you're trying to get people to look at a situation more of like from a witness perspective or an observer, just kind of stepping back and maybe getting a little bit of a bird's eye view.
Exactly. You know, and that's what I said to him. I want you to be a patient observer in your own experience. I don't want you to be in the experience, right? Because when we're in the experience, we miss those bits of information that help us integrate into who we are. And so, you know, stepping back and taking a look at it and noticing. And by the way, in EMDR, there's 2 things that we always say, right? Because you're silent, right? Every 20 seconds, I shut the machine off and I say, you know, I say in the beginning, I want a brief description of the last thing you're thinking of. So people will say, you know, I pulled up and I see this guy in the windshield. I'll say, all right, go with that. He goes back into the memory and he's incorporating the information. And we just say, notice that, and notice that. We want them. Remember, we believe that trauma is all about the mind's ability to process the information and give meaning to our experiences. Right? And that's as simple as it really is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, I do want to ask you a couple things, specifically about if someone is thinking about EMDR, they're listening to you and they're like, you know what, this could really help me. I've never heard of this before. Okay, I'm going to give this a try. Is there a certain number of sessions that, like, on average, like how many sessions does it take to quote unquote work? And then second, is there a percentage of success? Like, you have a number, 75% of the time it works, 95% of the time it works, or can you speak to that?
I can tell you this, out of the over 15,000 sessions I've done, there's only 4 people who
Wow.
did not receive relief. And they didn't receive relief because they were so blocked. Like there was, and I knew that. And, and sometimes there's a time to do this work and there's a time that they can't do this work. If people want to find an EMDR therapist, you go to EMDRIA, so EMDRIA, the International Association, EMDRIA.org, and click on Find a Therapist. You put in your zip code and interview each therapist. People can get trained in EMDR and only do it once a year. Right? So a certified EMDR therapist is somebody who has a minimum amount of hours. So you want to look for a certified EMDR therapist. Right? That's one way you can do it. And then the other thing is word of mouth. Like you start asking, who's a good EMDR therapist. Maybe you ask your primary care physician and stuff like that. If I have a minute, I want to talk about early interventions.
Yes, please
right? So think about this, right? Mm-hmm. So peer teams are out there, and I'm not here to say anything bad about any other intervention that's being used, but I've done hundreds of the Mitchell model, the CISD, and I choose not to do them anymore because I don't find them to be effective. EMDR, back in 1989, created what's called early interventions. And what they really are, they're aspects of the EMDR therapy that we're training peers to utilize. And as a yoga instructor and a mindfulness coach yourself, right? These are the skills of breath work, grounding exercises, stabilization exercises, all of the things that we know can allow people to feel a little bit more present in the moment and not be stuck out on the highway at a fatal accident. And so EMDR utilizes the tenets of its grounding and stabilization techniques, and we're teaching peer support teams to use these same techniques. So they actually have a skill, a book. We're creating a flip chart where you say, okay, I have the 4 elements exercise, or I have the 3-minute, concentration exercise. And so we're giving peers these tools. Because, with the other model, there's a diffusing, which means you do active listening, you offer support. But now we're actually going and we're actually utilizing a technique. They're called low-intensity interventions. And through Francine Shapiro, who created EMDR, knew that in other parts of the world that it would be easy and ethical to train non-licensed professionals to offer these stabilization and grounding techniques after a natural disaster or in a war-torn country. In 2017, I had the idea of grabbing those intervention skills, and why wouldn't we train our peer support officers in these really highly effective and, most important, safe. Oh my God, what are we doing? We're trying to de-escalate the nervous system, right, after a traumatic call, and we're using breath work, and we're using other grounding and stabilization techniques.
So if you have an incident that occurs, because, this happens all the time with our peer support team, we do still do debriefings and we do some diffusings. And if there's an incident, some of us may come in very shortly after and kind of check in on some people. So what you're saying is, instead of just doing the normal, hey, give them a little bit of psychoeducation, check in, you would actually, in a group setting or one-on-one, do these low intensity interventions. Okay.
Both. So in a diffusing model, it's one-on-one, right?
Okay.
And I would say to you, hey, just let's sit for like 5 minutes and just do a little bit of breathing, right? And I would guide that person through a 3-minute breathing exercise or a grounding technique, right? Or progressive muscle relaxation technique. So I've created a manual based on, so Francine Shapiro died 2 years ago. And in her last days of being with us, she had asked very prominent people in the world of EMDR to make sure that you push forward this paraprofessional, right? That's what we call them. And in the summer of 2019, I was invited to go to Geneva, and I'm trained as one of 12 people in the world to push forward Francine Shapiro's desire to train paraprofessionals. The only reason why I'm the only one in the United States, because we have plenty of resources. But the reason why I was asked is because the people in EMDR know that I treat first responders. And I had always said to them, we need to start treating our peer teams in these skills. And so I got invited, I got trained as a trainer. This is the stuff that Stephanie and I are talking about. Hopefully one day I'll go to Portland and I can train those folks in EMDR, EI skills. It's so exciting. And, it also has a group protocol. And I have modified the group protocol. It's been researched for about 11 years now. I've modified the group protocol just for first responders because first responders are more left brain oriented. Mm-hmm. So really exciting things on that part, and we can talk about it at another time if you'd like, and I can send you information. But I have 5 peer teams in Vermont that are using the early intervention skills, and I have a team in Pennsylvania that's also using those skills and looking to train all of Connecticut EMS in the same skills. And right now, because COVID has opened things up, we're having these negotiations. So it's a really exciting time for peer support, and as a former peer support person myself, I always felt like I didn't have enough skills, no matter what training I went to help my colleague in those moments. Now we have a set that you can choose from. And I say to my peer supporters, choose 1 or 2 of them and just get really good at it. That's all you need. You only need 1 or 2 of these skills that you can memorize. You don't have to have the flip chart with you. You can come and you can do that with and they'll really seek a lot of relief. One more thing about EMDR, right? Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. There's eye movement desensitization. Think about that, right? So a licensed therapist comes the moments after a critical incident. I can desensitize what that person is feeling about that incident way before they even get their first sleep cycle. Think about that. What a tool that is, right? And you think about it, why is that important? Because if we don't desensitize older traumatic events, we are more likely to be sensitive to future traumatic events. Mm-hmm. This really is the key.
Makes perfect sense.
Key to intervention, right?
So of the peer support teams that have been trained and that actually are utilizing these resources, what's the feedback been, or do you know from the people that are receiving it?
First of all, super busy. They're using them all the time. They have, let's see if I can find it here. 1 second. Hold on. Oh, here it is. We created a flip chart that has all the skills. I know you got some feedback here. Hold on. Okay, you with me? You with me?
I'm with you, yes.
Okay. So we created a flip chart, right? This is the one for heart math, but we created a flip chart that has all the skills on there that they stick in their pocket, their vest, they pull it out, they say, you know what, I'm going to do the 4 elements exercise with you. And even if they don't memorize it, it's all on this chart. And so you being a mindfulness coach because of your yoga, education, you know what it's like to have something that has been proven to be effective and that helps people. My people love it because, one, they feel like they're effective. It's just not the thing going in, hey, how you doing? We'll be all right, get some sleep, drink some water, don't drink tonight, right? It's a skill where we know that they're going to go home with a lower level of distress and hopefully get better sleep. And that all aids to the processing of traumatic events.
And it sounds like, just from the explanation you've provided so far, I really see a lot of crossover in some of the mindfulness and some of the things that we teach in yoga classes to begin with. It sounds really similar. I mean, I know there's more to it, obviously, but it reminds me a lot of that.
So for you to get trained in EI, it almost feel like a refresher course. And then, there are things in EMDR therapy that use, like, we compartmentalize. Like, we want officers to compartmentalize. And so we have what's called a container exercise, right? I want you to put that in a container. I want you to contain what's in front of you right now, and I want you to bring it to my office tomorrow, right? And so we do this mindfulness exercise of taking that call, that distress, putting it in something that can hold on to it, so it's not all over the place for me, right? And knowing that I can take this and I have some way of identifying what's happening, what's going on for me, and addressing it when it's a better time. So Yeah.
So do you ever have, because I know one of the things that you help agencies do is make policy, and you deal with decision makers and agency leaders. Is there ever any, because I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute, resistance? Is this kind of a quote woo-woo there? Because I've heard this before. Do you ever encounter that?
Oh yeah, what I said in the beginning, there's politics involved in just treating first responders. So the state is really embedded heavily in the CISD model. And, and I have those 10 organizations that trust what I do. And none of the chiefs question my reasoning for staying with the EMDR, which is brand new to everybody. And how come I'm not doing what the state is doing, right? And so the state has a statewide EAP, which is pushing the CISD and first responder model. No, and I say this to even EMDR therapists who want to work in law enforcement. I say, listen, your challenge for any person in a leadership position is to convince them that you're really good at what you're telling them you want to do. And any good chief is going to trust you. And my chiefs trust me. As a matter of fact, they've gone to bat for me against some high-level people in the state, asking them, how come your organization is not buying into this? And they tell them why. And the other thing is that, your experience, right? Now, maybe I'll use you as an example. Your experience is priceless. Your education and your skills in yoga and mindfulness is priceless. You know how to apply that and everything it does to help officers, right? That's what you rely upon, right? So it's a little bit outdated, but Albuquerque PD had a female police chief a few years ago who developed a really robust mindfulness program. And you can find it on YouTube. And just as you said earlier, your tactical instructors, your firearm instructors, your use of force instructors, all sitting around a table talking about how mindfulness has made them a better dad, a better mom, right? A better friend. Why aren't we recognizing the power of being present? It's just, it's just, and so, this is a gift that we have, right? We have these skills that you and I know are so effective for this population. Mm-hmm. What we still know really exists is that stigma.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we just got to keep chugging.
I was going to say, just slowly chipping away. And I've noticed since talking about all these things for almost 6 years now, there is progress. It's slow. It's very counterculture. I mean, you're changing the culture, and so that takes time. But I can say that it does feel different. It's getting embraced slowly. We still have a long way to go.
Yeah, and that's exciting, right? There's a long way to go. I mean, there's a lot of change that we can make, and and we're all really, you're really specializing in your specialty, and that's what makes you good. Like, I don't want to do anything else other than do EMDR with first responders, right? I don't want to do eating disorders and that, right? Thinking of programming that helps a police family. So we have workshops for families, right? We have groups for wives. I actually have therapists here. One is the wife of a police officer. One is the daughter of a police officer. Now we're treating.
I love that.
We're treating
love that.
Kids. Yeah. So we want to make sure that we are culturally competent in when we're helping families or officers deal with the stress and everything they see in this job. And I think that's just what separates us a lot from the general EAP.
Yeah, that's amazing, because that's something I really think needs to happen more, and we're trying to do that at the agency I work at, is really trying to incorporate the family into the wellness program through education, resources, communication, all those things. So, right. Wow, yeah. Kudos to you and your people, because that is fabulous, really.
Well, you're doing the same thing. You're in your lane, I'm in my lane. We're both thinking about it the same way. We both understand the challenges, right? But because we both walk the walk, right? We have the credibility to bring our brothers and sisters along and say, hey, listen, this shit really works, mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've been saying that for a while. So sometimes people still look at me a little crazy, and some people get it. So, Well, so real quick, and then I'm going to respect your time because we have been talking for a while, but I could keep talking to
Yeah.
you. You're so interesting. If someone wants to, in your area, or I guess even beyond, do they have to, if they want to utilize your services or your facilities, does it have to be only through their agency, or can someone just say, hey, I want to come see you, I want you to be my therapist, or
Anyone.
how does it work? Okay.
Anyone. And for your listeners, they can contact me directly. I'll give you my personal email. It's cop to cop, right? Pretty simple. COP, the number 2, cop to cop at hotmail.com.
Okay.
And, listen, I can help people find a therapist. Myself or my peers or some of my other staff can help people if they've got something going. Like I said, if it's something that would be really, well, here's another thing, right? So I do a lot of workers' compensation stuff, right? So people, even other therapists or even like a police chief, if I have a question about how do I get my person the help they need and what should we look for, I mean, I can help guide people in so many different areas.
That's great information. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And one last thing, because you keep mentioning it, is about finding like the right clinician in your area. If you don't mind speaking to listeners who aren't in Vermont, who are going to be
Sure.
in different states, because that's one thing we do work on here locally in Kansas, is we're really trying to come up with a vetting system so that we can do a lot of that up front for the folks to just say, here's a checklist. We're trying to develop this checklist, and a team of people that are going to quote unquote vet certain people in our area, so that if someone wants to go look at a therapist outside of our EAP, they'll know, okay, these 10 things or these 8 things were done. So, I mean, obviously you guys are awesome in your first responder wellness center, but for those who don't have that available, what do you recommend? How do you find culturally competent clinicians?
So 2 things, right? One is that we offer a consultation contract with organizations across the country, especially for peer support. So I'm available for consultation. I'm not here to drum up business. What I'd like people to do, and I know it can be difficult because I've had to do it myself for my out-of-state teams. You find a certified EMDR therapist. Doesn't mean they're going to be a good fit, right? Personalities, perception, beliefs, you have to really have a desire to want to work with law enforcement. You have a desire to want to understand the culture. So the first thing I would do is go to mgr.org, right? Find a therapist, right? You're going to get many in Kansas City, right? Oh, no, you're not. You're Wichita.
We're a couple hours from Kansas City, and we work quite a bit with people in Kansas City, but yeah, we're not right. We're a couple hours away.
So you're going to get a list of people, and I would start with certified EMDR therapists. They have the most training, all right? But doesn't mean they're the best. And see who's in your area, right? And then have a conversation with them. The ones that I've always contacted have always sounded very open to working with law enforcement. I have vetted them to a degree, but it really comes down to them showing up, meeting people, doing ride-alongs, right? Mm-hmm. Riding with the cops, having the cops say, hey, I really like this person. They were easy to talk to. And I think that's how you vet them.
Yeah, exactly. Once again, it goes back to knowing, liking, and trusting, and that familiarity.
Right.
So,
exactly.
And it's hard to find clinicians that are willing to do that, but it's important.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it can make or break the relationship, seriously, right? Yeah. For me, it's and I always walk that fine line because I know all of the police chiefs personally, and officers has to trust that I don't bring anything to the chief that I should not bring to the chief, right? And I always say to my clients, you're my client, not the police department. Listen, my job is to poke the chief, tell them what they're not doing right. And if they don't like that, they can fire me, and that'd be okay too. But it's very clear where my ethics lie. My ethics lie in advocating for my clients, which are the members of the organizations. Although the department pays to have a contract with the center, my obligation, based on my license, is to my client.
Yeah, and that just speaks volumes with the agencies that you've contracted with, that they recognize and understand that, and that they put the officers' mental and emotional well-being before anything personal, that they want to know what's going on.
Right. Yeah, and I've had arguments with chiefs. I mean, they've slammed the door and yelled at me. And I said, well, what do you want to do? You can either fire me or let me do what I just said I want to do. Or I need you, like I would go to them, I need you to do this. What are you doing that for, right? And, some of them get tied up in, well, he's been a jerk for, 20 years. And I'm like, I have to say to them, but they're asking for help now. Right? I had one person, he was the most disciplined person in this police department. And I went to the chief and I said, how's that working for you? He says, it's not. And I said, that's my point. My point is, let's get this person the help they need. So, I do have fun in my job, and I do respect all of the police officials that I've ever interacted with. But what's interesting is, like, this, you could go into your chief's office, and you can tell him from the heart what you really think is the best thing for this officer, and give him that information or her that information so they can make the right decision. And we need people like you and me out there.
Well, it's obvious that you are so passionate and care so much about police officers and first responders. And I just want to thank you for everything that you do. And I have really enjoyed talking to you. You're probably somebody I'm going to keep in contact with. I might kind of stalk you a little bit.
That's okay. Listen, really thank you for what you do. I had a big chuckle when I saw your podcast, and obviously the name I think is perfect. And I was saying, why didn't I think of that? But anyway, there are people like you and me and Stephanie out there doing this great work. We encourage more people to get into this line of work, and especially people who have done the work and know the benefit of it. It speaks volumes to what we say and why people believe that what we're doing is super important. Listen, hopefully we have a long run at this, and so we can really make some profound changes in leadership and just the system of how we just let people. It's really tough to do this work.
Well, yes, and I am going to make sure that everything that you mentioned, I was furiously writing things down, links in the show notes, so that if people want to get a hold of you or contact you directly, go to your website, they'll have the ability to do that. So Sonny, thank you so much.
My pleasure, seriously.
I hope you enjoyed that episode with Sonny. If you find value in this episode, please share it, give us a review, and if you'd like to be notified of future episodes and want to receive our future newsletter, you can subscribe on our Podbean website. I'd love to hear from you with questions, suggestions, or ideas for future guests or topics that you'd like to hear about.